Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
It had been almost 4 years since I last sat at that worn-out oak dining table, the one my father built back in the 70s with his bare hands and not a single nail, just owls and pride and the kind of silence that hung over our house like cheap wallpaper. The chairs still creaked the same way they did when I was 12, nervously squirming under my mother's disappointed stare while Jake, my younger brother by 3 years, cracked another joke that had everyone at the table howling. It's funny how time changes everything except the things that hurt the most. The smell of roast beef and overcooked carrots filled the air, but all I could really taste was the years I spent trying to earn a seat that never felt mine. Mom had gone all out for this one, even though it was just a family Sunday dinner. She called it a pre-celebration code for another chance to sing Jake's praises before the official housewarming party next week. His new home, according to her, was absolutely to die for, with a sunken living room, whatever that meant, and a custom marble island that she mentioned 5 times before I even sat down. She was practically glowing as she set the plates down, talking about how Kara, Jake's fiancée, had such exquisite taste, how the kitchen backsplash looked like something out of a Nancy Meyers movie, how the neighbors already loved them. I kept my mouth shut. I chewed and nodded when appropriate. But every word she spoke felt like a layer of insulation, pushing me further away from a family I stopped trying to impress a long time ago. Jake, of course, lapped it all up with that same easy grin that got him out of trouble from the day he learned how to lie with charm. He told a story about the contractor almost messing up the pool dimensions, how he had to take charge and correct it himself, even though I knew from LinkedIn updates that Kara's dad had footed most of the bill and hired the crew. Still, Mom laughed like it was the first she'd ever heard of such assertiveness from her darling boy. Dad said little, as usual. He sat at the head of the table, nodding every now and then, his hands folded neatly in front of him like a soldier awaiting orders. I could see his eyes drift toward the television in the living room, muted, still showing reruns of some old Western. I used to wonder why he never stood up for me. Now I understood, he just never stood up for anyone unless it came with a rank and a uniform. Somewhere between the second glass of boxed red wine and Jake's second story about negotiating with the tile guy, riveting stuff, my hands went cold. I looked at my plate and realized I hadn't even touched the beef, just kept cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, like I was trying to make something ugly disappear by breaking it down into silence. No one asked me how I'd been. Not once. I had taken a flight from Seattle to Chicago, rented a car, sat in traffic, all to sit in a room where my absence these past few years hadn't even made a dent in their reality. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was something older than anger, a kind of quiet resolve that simmers until it thickens into something almost holy. And then dessert came. It was cherry pie, Jake's favorite. Not mine. Mine had always been lemon meringue, sharp, light, unapologetic. Like me. But Mom never made it. Not even when I was 13 and won that regional math competition. Jake had broken a finger that week, and everyone forgot. The table was quieter now, the edge of the wine kicking in, the food settling heavy in all the wrong places. I took a slow sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough that it turned heads. That's when I said it. Funny, I murmured, my fork gently tapping the edge of my plate. I settled down years ago. Just didn't feel like sharing it with people who called me a failure. The words didn't crash into the room. They slipped in like a draft through a cracked window, quiet, but unmistakably cold. Jake stopped mid-bite. Mom's fork paused midair. Dad blinked once. Even Kara, who had mostly kept her glossy eyes on Jake's mouth all evening, looked up and tilted her head like a confused puppy who just heard its name for the first time. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable. It was surgical. It sliced through every polite little fiction we'd been spoon-fed for decades. I watched Mom's face as she blinked once, then twice, trying to process if what I'd said was a joke. Her smile twitched. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, and for a moment, just a second, I saw something behind her eyes I'd never seen before. The barest flicker of guilt. Or maybe just confusion. Jake, predictably, leaned back in his chair and let out a chuckle, That same chuckle he used in high school when he got caught cheating, but somehow still managed to sweet-talk the teacher into giving him a B. Still bitter after all these years, huh, he said, lifting his wine glass like a punchline. I turned my eyes toward him slowly, letting them settle. Still pretending you earned it all, huh? And just like that, the table wasn't a table anymore. It was a stage. And every person at it had just realized they weren't the audience, they were part of the script. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. And they had no idea what was coming next. Because here's the thing. I hadn't said everything. Not even close. I'd just pulled back the curtain. And in the next few hours, I was going to burn the whole damn theater down. Not with rage. With truth. One careful sentence at a time. But let me ask you something, just between us, what would you have done? If your whole life had been shoved to the background, repackaged as a cautionary tale, your wins buried, your identity ignored, would you stay quiet over cherry pie? Or would you finally speak? Because that's where it starts. Not with a scream, but with a fork. And the truth you've been saving for dessert. For a while after I said it, no one moved, and the silence wasn't the comfortable kind that falls between people who know each other well, who don't need to fill the air with noise to feel connected, but the sharp, brittle silence of a room full of people who've just heard something they can't unhear, the kind of quiet that amplifies the sound of a fork sliding against porcelain or a breath held just a second too long. I didn't repeat myself. I didn't explain. I just sat there, calm, my hands folded, my cherry pie untouched, as if I had merely observed the weather or made a passing comment about the wallpaper, not dropped a truth that had been building in me for over 2 decades like sediment in a riverbed, thick and heavy and impossible to move without causing a flood. Jake's little smirk faded just enough to expose the edge of something sharper beneath it, a discomfort he wasn't used to feeling at this table, where he had always been the center of gravity. The golden boy with the easy jokes and the louder voice and the endless supply of second chances. But even he seemed unsure how to steer the conversation back into safer waters, and for the first time in a very long time, I could see that he didn't know what was coming next, and the not knowing made him sweat. My mother was still staring at me as if she might discover, with enough squinting, that I was joking, that I hadn't meant what I said, that I'd laugh and brush it off and tell everyone not to be so dramatic. But I wasn't going to save her from this moment. Not anymore. I had done that too many times before, covered for her forgetfulness, her biased pride, her habit of turning away when the truth became inconvenient. I let her flounder, just a little, and sipped my water as if I hadn't just shattered the artificial peace she worked so hard to preserve. Kara, seated at Jake's side, leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped in her lap in a way that was probably meant to project neutrality, but instead revealed a quiet anticipation. The kind of poised readiness I'd seen in corporate meetings before someone drops a deal-breaker clause on the table. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft and sweet, laced with that Midwestern faux politeness that's been passed down like family china, fragile, formal, and entirely fake. "Oh," she said with a gentle laugh that didn't touch her eyes, "you're married? I didn't realize. Jake never mentioned." Her voice trailed off, giving me the space to either correct her or explain myself, but I did neither. I simply looked up, nodded once, and let the words come naturally, without emphasis, without drama, just clean and true, like pulling a curtain aside to reveal what's been there the whole time. "Yeah," I said, locking eyes with her. "Been married almost 6 years now." The pause that followed was not accidental. I let it settle, watched them digest the sentence like it was a puzzle with one piece still missing, and then added the final blow with the same calmness as before. "To my wife." The reaction was instantaneous, but not loud. No one shouted, no one gasped, but I could see the twitch in my mother's jaw, the way my father's fingers tightened slightly around his glass, and most of all, the sudden absence of breath in Jake, who looked away, then back again, trying to gauge whether I was messing with him or telling the truth. It hit them all differently. For my mother, it was confusion mixed with a dawning fear that she had missed something deeply important, something she couldn't blame on being busy or tired or distracted by Jake's never-ending escapades. For Jake, it was annoyance, The kind of irritation people feel when the story they've written about someone else starts to crumble in front of them. And for Kara, well, Kara just stared at me for a moment too long, then looked away, and I could tell she was recalibrating everything. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let them sit in it. Let them squirm a little. Because I wanted them to know what it felt like to be the afterthought, the mystery, the shadow at the edge of the family photograph. I wanted them to taste the discomfort of being faced with a truth they had no control over, no say in, no way to shape into something more comfortable. Mom finally cleared her throat, her voice catching just slightly as she reached for the only sentence she could think to say, the one women like her were trained to use when the world didn't behave as expected. Well, Samantha, she said, using my full name like it might somehow establish authority, you never told us. How are we supposed to know? I tilted my head just slightly, folded my napkin in my lap, and replied, not with anger or even sarcasm, but with the kind of clarity that comes only after years of holding your breath. You never asked. I saw the color drain slightly from her face, not all at once, but gradually, like paint fading in the sun. Jake shifted in his seat, and Kara reached for her wine glass, sipping slowly, carefully, like she was trying not to spill. And then, because Jake could never leave well enough alone, because he always needed the last word, or at least a word loud enough to steer the story back in his favor, he leaned in and said, in that smug, half-joking tone that had gotten him out of everything from traffic tickets to community service, guess that explains why you were always so intense about everything. I mean, we kind of figured something was off. There it was. The smirk. The implication. The dismissal dressed as humor. I could have let it slide. I could have smiled and nodded and moved on. But I had waited far too long to let him off that easily. So I leaned back in my chair, gave him a slow smile, and replied just as sweetly, hey, speaking of things you figured, remember that DUI you got sophomore year? The one Mom and Dad paid to make disappear. The look on Jake's face wasn't anger or fear, not yet. It was the stunned, bewildered look of a man who thought he'd locked the doors, only to realize someone had the key the whole time. Kara's glass paused midair. Her eyes flicked to Jake, then to me, then back to Jake, searching his face for a lie or an explanation. What DUI? She asked, her voice low, steady, suddenly colder than it had been all evening. And that right there was the moment the ground began to shift beneath his feet. I didn't say anything else. I just picked up my fork, took a bite of the cherry pie, still too sweet, still too sticky, and smiled. The taste wasn't good, but it was satisfying. They wanted stories. I had plenty. And dessert was just getting started. If there had been even a sliver of a chance that the evening could recover from what had already been spoken, a narrow window where everyone could have collectively decided to sweep it under the rug, chalk it up to too much wine or a bad mood or years of unspoken tensions boiling over for just one moment, it vanished entirely the instant Kara leaned forward in her chair, the soft click of her bracelet audible in the silence, and asked, in a tone that was calm but unmistakably demanding, Jake, what DUI? There was no disguising it now, no slipping it under the surface of polite conversation or brushing it off with one of Jake's usual shrugs and half-smiles, the ones that always got him out of trouble when we were kids and somehow still worked well into adulthood. On teachers, on girls, on bosses, and most successfully, on our parents. He froze, just for a heartbeat, but that single pause was enough. Kara's expression didn't change, but her posture did, her spine straightened, her eyes narrowed slightly, not in fury, not yet, but in calculation, and I knew that whatever fairy tale narrative she'd been fed about my brother, it had just developed a hairline crack that would only widen the longer she looked at him. Jake tried to laugh it off, and to be fair, he made a decent attempt. Babe, he said, dragging the word out the way a child does when they're trying to defuse a parent's glare. It was college. Everyone made stupid mistakes. It was barely anything. A night gone a little sideways. But Kara didn't blink. You told me you never got in trouble, she said, not accusatory, not loud, but with a quiet finality that let me know she was not asking for reassurance. She was demanding truth. That was when the unraveling began. I sat back and watched, not with cruelty, but with a strange, detached sense of justice, the way someone might watch a dam finally giving way after years of pressure and patch jobs, knowing that it wasn't your fault the cracks had been there to begin with. All you did was stop pretending they weren't. Mom was already flustered, her napkin twisted between her fingers, her voice brittle as she tried to intervene. It was nothing, Kara, truly. We handled it. It was expunged. Not even on his record anymore. He was just a kid. But Kara didn't look at her. Her eyes were still fixed on Jake, and it was in that moment I realized she was smarter than I had given her credit for. She had the kind of poised intelligence that stayed silent until it was absolutely necessary to speak, and when she did, every word landed with precision. "You lied," she said quietly. "Not just to me. To yourself." Jake scoffed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the same nervous tell he had when we were teenagers, and he knew he'd been caught. "Samantha's just stirring the pot," he muttered, not looking at me, but not quite able to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "She's always been good at that. A real expert in drama." I didn't rise to the bait. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. So instead, I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and let my gaze settle on my father, who up until that moment had remained characteristically silent, his eyes fixed somewhere between his plate and the far wall. There was something about his silence that had always struck me as strategic, not ignorance, not apathy, but a deep, willful refusal to engage with anything messy, anything that required him to step out of his stoic neutrality. But I was done letting him off the hook. "You remember, right, Dad?" I asked, my voice steady. "You were the one who drove out there to pick him up that night. You and I were supposed to have dinner. You canceled. Said something came up." The room froze again, this time colder than before, and I could see my father's jaw clench, the muscle twitching just slightly, but still, he didn't speak. I held his gaze anyway. "That was the night I told you I was gay," I added, the words falling easily now, not out of defiance, but out of clarity, like removing dust from a forgotten photograph. "You said we'd talk about it later. But we never did. Because Jake needed you." My mother looked away then, her face blank, as if staring at the wall could undo the words or rewrite the history she'd conveniently edited over the years. I wondered if she even remembered that night the way I did, the way I sat by the window for hours, waiting for someone to come back and acknowledge that I had said something real, something important, only to find myself alone again, eclipsed by the latest Jake catastrophe. "You're twisting things," Jake said suddenly, his voice rising just slightly, the mask slipping now. "That's not how it happened." But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Kara was already leaning away from him now, her body turned slightly, the warmth gone from her posture, replaced by a calculating stillness. She wasn't just reevaluating Jake, she was reevaluating the whole family myth. And I could see it in her face, the understanding that she'd walked into a story halfway through, and now the plot twist was unraveling everything she thought she knew. I stood then, slowly, not with drama, not with a final flourish, but with the weight of everything that had finally settled in its proper place. I picked up my plate, still mostly full, and carried it into the kitchen, rinsed it off in the sink, and stood for a moment staring out the window at the darkening yard. The brittle November branches tapping against the glass like fingers trying to remind me how far I had come. When I turned back, I found my mother standing in the doorway, her hands wringing together in front of her like a woman who had run out of words, but still couldn't bring herself to apologize. "Why didn't you ever tell us about your wife?" she asked, almost whispering. And for once, I didn't snap, didn't throw the words back at her with the fury I used to carry like armor. Instead, I just answered simply, honestly, and without a trace of bitterness. Because I knew he wouldn't ask about her. Just like you never asked about me. I walked past her then, not waiting for a response, and headed back toward the table, where Kara was still sitting, now staring at Jake like he was a stranger who'd knocked on her door pretending to be someone else. The illusion was broken. The golden boy's shine had started to tarnish. And the truth, mine, had finally found a seat at the table. And the best part? I hadn't even told them the real secret yet. The one that would take everything they thought they knew and turn it on its head. That would come later. I was just getting started. It's a strange thing, watching someone lose control of a room they've always assumed would orbit around them no matter what chaos they stirred into it, and as I took my seat again, the cushion still warm from where I'd left it, I saw the smallest crack in Jake's carefully curated performance widen just enough to let something real slip through. Not vulnerability exactly, but a quiet panic. The kind that lives just under the skin when you realize the story you've been telling about yourself. The one everyone in your life has politely agreed to participate in is starting to collapse under the weight of actual facts. There was something so deeply satisfying about the way he kept shifting in his chair, not enough to draw attention, but just enough that it betrayed the discomfort he could no longer smooth over with charm or laughter or that cocky head tilt that used to make teachers forgive missed homework and girlfriends excuse whole days of silence. Kara had pulled away from him just slightly, and it wasn't the kind of dramatic distance you see in soap operas or clumsy breakups, but the subtle shift of someone recalibrating their internal compass. A woman suddenly questioning whether the person she planned to build a life with might, in fact, be built on foundation soil that was never meant to hold the weight of another human being's trust. Her eyes stayed on him, unblinking, and even though she didn't raise her voice or cry or make a scene, the message was clear in every movement of her body. She wanted answers, real ones, not the polished, deflected version Jake had become so good at offering to people who never thought to push harder. My mother, meanwhile, had retreated to the familiar rhythms of avoidance, reaching for the pie server again, insisting gently that we all move on, please, we've had enough drama for one night. As if the depth of our family dysfunction could be smoothed over with another slice of dessert, as though cherry pie might sponge up the years of favoritism, neglect, and quiet betrayal that had thickened like mold around our dinner table. I watched her fumble with the crust, her hands slightly trembling, and for the first time, it didn't make me angry, it just made me tired. Tired of how she always reached for comfort over truth, for calm over clarity, even when it came at the cost of honesty. Jake, desperate to steer things back toward familiar territory, leaned forward with a forced grin and tried to make light of it all, saying something about how he didn't remember half of college anyway, how it was a blur of late nights and cheap beer, but no one laughed. Not even Dad, who usually chuckled along with whatever Jake said as a way to keep the peace, his own brand of cowardice masked as diplomacy. No. This time Dad stayed silent, and his silence wasn't neutral, it was complicit, and Jake felt it. I could tell, because for the first time since we were kids, he looked truly alone at that table. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the wood I'd once carved initials into with a butter knife at 13, and spoke clearly, each word steady and precise, like stepping stones laid carefully across a river that no longer scared me. You should tell her about the lawsuit, I said, not angrily, not even accusingly, just matter of fact, as if I were reminding someone they'd left the stove on. The air shifted again, heavier now, and Jake's jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to calculate whether denying it would work or whether he needed to lie more creatively. Kara's head turned sharply toward him, and I saw her mouth part slightly, not with surprise, but with the dawning realization that what she'd just heard wasn't the worst part, it was the possibility that there might be more. And that whatever she thought she'd built with Jake might rest on a series of omissions too carefully curated to be accidental. What lawsuit? She asked, and this time there was no warmth, no smile, no feigned patience. Jake tried to wave it off, mumbling something about a disgruntled client and how people in real estate love to sue when things don't go their way, but I wasn't about to let him rewrite that chapter, not when it still cost me sleep some nights. It wasn't just a client, I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. It was an elderly couple who lost everything because Jake sold them a condemned property under a shell company and then ghosted them when the city evicted them. They didn't know the house was unlivable until they moved in. He falsified the disclosures. They sued. He tried to settle, but the city got involved. Jake's face went pale, not immediately, not dramatically, but in a slow, creeping way that told me he had truly hoped that part of his past would never be spoken aloud in front of people who hadn't already agreed to forgive him. I turned to Kara, who was now staring at me, as if trying to decide whether to thank me or scream. He never told you, I continued, because our parents covered it. Paid off what they could. Buried the rest. But the couple still had to move into a motel for almost a year. I sent them money. Quietly. Because I couldn't stand the thought that they thought we were all like him. My father's eyes met mine then, really met mine, and I saw in them something I hadn't seen in years. Shame. Real, bone-deep shame. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out, and after a moment, he looked away again, not back to the television this time, but to the center of the table, as if the grain in the wood might tell him what to do next. Jake pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up too quickly, muttering something under his breath about needing air or being ambushed, but no one moved to stop him. Not Kara. Not Mom. Not even Dad. When the front door shut behind him, it was like someone had popped a blister. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape, becoming something raw and exposed and impossible to ignore. I stood slowly, collected the empty glasses in front of me, and walked them into the kitchen without speaking, the silence behind me no longer hostile, but hollow. And as I stood at the sink, the water running over my hands, the light from the window casting a long shadow across the countertop, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit until that moment. I hadn't come here to hurt anyone. I hadn't even come here to win. I'd come because for the first time in my life, I didn't want to hide. Not who I was. Not what I knew. Not the version of this family that lived behind the polished photos and polite holiday cards. And I had no intention of apologizing for any of it. Because sometimes the truth isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It doesn't have to come with shouting or breaking plates or storming out of rooms. Sometimes the truth just sits at the table with you, quiet and undeniable, and waits for everyone to stop pretending it isn't there. And the most powerful revenge? It's not revenge at all. It's living in a truth that others are still too afraid to admit even exists. The door didn't slam when Jake left, though I imagine he wanted it to make a scene, to assert some kind of final authority, to signal that he was the one choosing to leave rather than the one being slowly surgically cut out of the narrative he dominated for decades, but instead, the door clicked shut with a softness that betrayed him, the kind of exit that makes you feel smaller on the way out than you ever felt walking in, and in the stillness that followed, something unspoken settled over the room, thick as dust and just as impossible to ignore. The weight of what had been said, and even more so, the things that hadn't yet been said, hung between us like smoke, not choking exactly, but undeniable, curling into the corners of our silence and making it clear that there was no going back to who we were at the start of that dinner. Kara remained seated, her hands resting on either side of her plate, palms flat, like a woman anchoring herself to the present moment while her mind raced through every past one, recalibrating the memories, reinterpreting the smiles, the reassurances, the casual lies dressed up as jokes that suddenly didn't seem so harmless. Her posture hadn't collapsed, but something in her face had changed, hardened maybe, or perhaps clarified, and I could see in her eyes the quiet fury of someone who'd been sold a polished version of a life and now saw, with brutal clarity, the hairline fractures running straight through its core. She didn't speak, not right away, and neither did I, because there are moments where language feels too small for what's happening, where everything that needs to be communicated pulses in the silence between breaths. My mother was the first to break, not with words, but with movement. She stood slowly, her hands smoothing the front of her blouse in that mechanical way she always did when she didn't know how to process what she was feeling. As if wrinkles in the fabric were easier to handle than the wrinkles in the story of the family she'd spent a lifetime trying to curate. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, her eyes flitting between Kara and me like she was searching for a version of reality that could be repaired with a well-timed compliment or a forced smile. But nothing came. And in that moment, I realized something that hit harder than any of Jake's past cruelties. She wasn't just uncomfortable. She was afraid. Not of me. Not even of the truth I'd spoken. but of the possibility that she had always known, somewhere deep beneath her denial, that everything wasn't as perfect as she'd pretended. That maybe, just maybe, she had chosen the child who made her feel good over the one who told her things she didn't want to hear. I stood, not with drama or bitterness, but with the same quiet composure I'd been practicing for years, the stillness of a woman who has spent enough time being silenced that she no longer needs permission to speak. I walked toward the hallway without a word, reached into my coat pocket, and returned with a small, carefully wrapped package that I placed in front of my mother without ceremony. She stared at it like it might explode, her hands hovering above it before finally untying the ribbon and unfolding the brown paper to reveal a frame, simple, wooden, nothing ornate, holding a single photo. It was a picture of me and Eliza, my wife, standing in front of our house in Seattle, both of us in jeans, hair messy from the wind, grinning like idiots the day we finished building our raised garden beds, dirt under our nails and sweat on our foreheads. Behind us, our home, modest, beautiful, with the soft gray siding we picked out together, a porch swing Eliza found at a flea market, and windows that always caught the afternoon light. It wasn't glossy or extravagant or the kind of house that gets shown off during dinner parties, but it was ours. Paid off. Built with patience. A home in every sense of the word. I watched my mother's expression shift as she took it in, the corners of her mouth tightening, her eyes darting across the photo as if trying to make sense of the joy in it, a joy she had never been part of, not because she wasn't welcome, but because she had never asked to be. I never needed you to be proud of me, I said quietly, my voice steady, not a tremor in it, but I did need you to see me. And you didn't. You still don't, really. And that's okay. I've stopped waiting for it. She opened her mouth, but I held up my hand gently, not with anger, just with finality. You don't need to say anything, I continued. You've spent your whole life telling stories about our family that make you feel safe. This just isn't one of them. Kara stood then, slowly, her eyes still on the photo, and for the first time all evening, she looked at me not as Jake's sister, not as the bitter sibling or the outlier, or the one who didn't belong, but as a woman who had carried a quiet truth longer than she should have had to. She didn't smile, didn't say much, just a simple, "Can I get your number?" which was all I needed to know she wasn't done thinking about everything she had learned tonight. I gave it to her, scribbled on a napkin like we were teenagers again, passing notes in a world that didn't want us to speak too loudly, and she tucked it into her purse with a nod that said more than words could manage. I grabbed my coat, slung it over my arm, and made my way toward the front door, pausing just long enough to turn back toward my parents, who still sat there, my mother clutching the photo, my father staring into space, and I said, without cruelty, "I didn't come here to punish you. I came to free myself. And I have." Then I stepped outside, the night colder than I remembered, but also clearer, like the kind of air that follows a storm, the world freshly washed, but not quite dry. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the porch light cast a soft glow on the sidewalk, and for the first time in years I felt lighter, not because anything had been fixed or forgiven, but because nothing was hiding anymore. Funny thing about dessert, people think it's the reward at the end of a meal. The sweet closure, the harmless indulgence, but the truth is, dessert has always been the most dangerous part. It's where the masks slip, where the smiles turn tight, where the polite conversation gives way to confessions and revelations, and the kind of honesty that makes people squirm. And tonight, dessert had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had revealed who we really were. And as I walked to my car, the cold biting at my fingers and the night settling in around me, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad, either. I was something else entirely, something sharper, cleaner, and infinitely more powerful. I was free. And as I drove away, I didn't look back. Because some homes you're born into. Others you build yourself. One brick of truth at a time.